The official record says you are living through an era of remarkable economic stability. Gross domestic product expanded at a steady 2.1% in the first quarter of 2026. Unemployment sat at a comfortable 4.2% in June. By every classical metric taught in business schools and cited by central bankers, these are not crisis figures. They are the markers of a soft landing, a resilient system humming along precisely as intended. Yet inside millions of American households, the math has fundamentally collapsed. Paychecks are larger than they have ever been, but the grocery receipt feels like an insult. Rent eats up a fraction of income that would have looked like an obvious typo 5 years ago. Saving money no longer feels like a discipline, it feels like a mathematical impossibility. There is a profound systemic disconnect between the spreadsheet and the street, a silent structural fracture where macro-prosperity conceals micro-exhaustion. You are not mismanaging your budget, you are experiencing the widening canyon between a statistical abstraction called the economy and the physical reality of surviving inside it. To understand why this trap is springing now, you have to look past the top-line headlines and examine the invisible mechanisms of modern decay. When price increases slow down, the public is told that inflation is under control. But a declining rate of inflation does not mean prices are falling, it means they are climbing at a slightly less aggressive pace from an already astronomical baseline. The elevated costs of housing, energy, food, and insurance do not reset, they solidify. They become the permanent floor. Meanwhile, the labor market is executing a subtle defensive shift that evades government detection entirely. Corporations, terrified of bad press, are avoiding mass, high-profile layoffs. Instead, they are quietly cutting overtime, capping weekend shifts, reducing weekly hours, and leaving open positions permanently unfilled. A worker stays officially employed, keeping the national jobless rate deceptively pristine at 4.2%, while their actual take-home pay shrinks month after month. The workload expands, the paycheck compresses. It is a ghost recession, a squeeze that leaves no trace on federal dashboards, but steadily drains the financial breathing room of anyone relying on an hourly wage or a fixed salary. This dynamics creates a radically bifurcated society, where two neighbors living on the exact same street inhabit entirely different financial eras. Consider the mechanics of the housing lock-in effect. One neighbor bought her home in 2020, securing a 30-year fixed mortgage at an historic low near 3%. Her primary monthly living expense is permanently frozen in time, granting her a structural defense against broader monetary erosion. Her next-door neighbor buys the identical layout in 2025 at prevailing interest rates. Even if the nominal sticker price drops slightly, his monthly mortgage obligation is nearly double hers before he even turns on the lights or buys a gallon of milk. Same neighborhood, same regional economy, completely irreconcilable financial realities. The modern American economy no longer distributes its pressure evenly. It rewards those who acquired hard assets before the liquidity flood and punishes anyone trying to enter the market today. This isn't merely a temporary squeeze, it is the systematic dismantling of generational upward mobility. As housing costs absorb an unprecedented percentage of net income, the traditional timeline of adult life is being forcibly stretched. Young professionals with solid career trajectories are moving back into childhood bedrooms or renting micro-units, spaces smaller than traditional studio apartments, simply to keep overhead from consuming their entire paycheck. Emergency funds evaporate, down payments take decades rather than years to accumulate. Major life decisions, marriage, children, property ownership, are not being rejected out of cultural preference, but deferred because the financial runway required to achieve them keeps extending into the horizon. The statistical machinery of the state measures aggregate wealth, but it fails to capture the quiet, cumulative loss of human agency. And that brings us to the core open loop of this entire crisis. If the foundational metrics we use to evaluate national health, GDP, headline inflation, and unemployment, can report robust stability while the underlying population suffers a severe contraction in living standards, then those metrics are no longer diagnostic tools. They are camouflage. How did the world's most sophisticated economy construct a statistical mirror that reflects prosperity while hiding systemic strain? What invisible structural mechanics are extracting wealth from the daily routine without triggering the alarm bells of a traditional crash? To discover why the official numbers no longer match human experience, we have to trace the origin of this design back to a series of fateful policy decisions, geographic traps, and hidden structural shifts that rewired the rules of American capitalism. The origins of the current economic divergence trace back to structural shifts executed over decades across fiscal policy, real estate markets, and global supply chain architectures. Understanding the present gap between macroeconomic data and household liquidity requires an examination of three decisive catalysts: the federal policy response to the 2008 financial crisis, the pandemic-era stimulus interventions of 2020 through 2021, and the subsequent monetary tightening cycle initiated by the Federal Reserve in March 2022. Following the collapse of the subprime mortgage market in 2008, the Federal Reserve implemented quantitative easing, purchasing trillions of dollars in long-term Treasury securities and agency mortgage-backed securities. This policy maintained the federal funds rate near zero for nearly a decade. While intended to stimulate business investment, ultra-low interest rates fundamentally altered the incentives governing asset ownership. Institutional capital, seeking yields higher than those offered by traditional debt instruments, began flowing directly into residential real estate. Private equity firms and corporate entities acquired hundreds of thousands of single-family homes across high-growth metropolitan areas, transforming entry-level housing stock into yield-generating rental portfolios. Between 2010 and 2019, residential housing construction failed to keep pace with demographic demand. Following the housing bust, home builders significantly scaled back production, resulting in a cumulative deficit estimated by industry analysts at over 3.8 million housing units by the end of the decade. As supply remained constrained, asset values rose steadily, benefiting existing property owners while raising entry barriers for first-time buyers. The trajectory accelerated dramatically during the economic disruptions of 2020. In response to global lockdowns, federal authorities deployed unprecedented fiscal expansion. Congress authorized over $5 trillion in relief packages, including direct stimulus payments, expanded unemployment compensation, and the Paycheck Protection Program. Simultaneously, the Federal Reserve expanded its balance sheet from $4.1 trillion in early 2020 to a peak exceeding $8.9 trillion in 2022, while mortgage rates dropped to historical lows, averaging 2.65% in January 2021. This massive injection of liquidity, combined with global supply bottlenecks and shifting consumer demand, triggered the highest rates of inflation observed in 40 years. The Consumer Price Index, which measures the average change over time in the prices paid by urban consumers for a market basket of goods and services, peaked at an annualized rate of 9.1% in June 2022. Prices for core necessities rose rapidly. Grocery indexes jumped over 13% year-over-year at their peak, while energy prices experienced sharp volatility driven by geopolitical conflicts and supply disruptions. To combat escalating inflation, the Federal Reserve initiated an aggressive monetary tightening campaign in March 2022, raising the benchmark federal funds rate from near zero to a range of 5.25 to 5.50% over 16 months. This rapid rate escalation produced immediate structural distortions throughout the housing market. Prior to the rate hikes, an estimated 85% of existing home mortgage holders held interest rates below 5%, with over 60% holding rates below 4%. As 30-year fixed mortgage rates climbed above 7% in late 2023 and remained elevated into subsequent years, existing homeowners became structurally disincentivized to sell. Relocating meant relinquishing a low-cost mortgage to finance a new property at double or triple the interest rate. This mechanism, known as the mortgage lock-in effect, froze an inventory across the nation. Resale listings plummeted, preventing the market-clearing mechanism that historically lowers home prices during periods of elevated interest rates. Consequently, prospective buyers faced a compound burden. Home prices remained near record highs due to restricted supply, while monthly borrowing costs escalated sharply due to higher interest rates. According to housing affordability indexes, the portion of median household income required to service a mortgage on a median-priced home rose from roughly 21% in 2019 to over 34% by 2024, marking the least affordable housing market in modern recording. The impact extended directly into the rental sector. Families priced out of home ownership remained in the rental pool longer, maintaining upward pressure on lease rates. In major Sunbelt markets such as Phoenix, Tampa, and Atlanta, average residential rents escalated by more than 30% between 2020 and 2023. Although construction of multifamily apartment units reached multi-decade highs in 2024, providing localized relief, absolute rent levels remained stabilized at significantly higher baselines than pre-pandemic norms. Simultaneously, labor market dynamics began undergoing an unannounced transformation. While headline job creation numbers remained positive throughout 2023 and 2024, subsequent administrative revisions painted a different structural reality. The Bureau of Labor Statistics routinely issued downward benchmark adjustments to initial monthly employment estimates, revealing that net job growth was significantly lower than initially reported. Furthermore, detailed breakdowns of employment data indicated that a substantial portion of new jobs consisted of part-time positions, secondary employment, or public sector roles, rather than high-wage corporate or industrial positions. Average hourly earnings grew nominally over this period, but real wage growth, wages adjusted for inflation, remained negative or flat for 26 consecutive months between early 2021 and mid-2023. Although nominal paychecks increased, the cumulative compounding effect of price increases across non-discretionary expenses outpaced wage accumulation. By the time inflation rates began moderating toward target levels, the aggregate price level remained approximately 20% higher than in 2020. The structural cost of basic living expenses had permanently elevated, laying the foundation for the persistent economic friction observed today. The ongoing divergence between macroeconomic statistics and household liquidity is actively defined by structural shifts in credit usage, corporate pricing strategies, and regional demographic pressures. As core living expenses absorb a higher percentage of disposable income, consumer debt mechanisms have transitioned from instruments of discretionary financing to primary buffers for operational living costs. Federal Reserve data tracking consumer balance sheets shows total credit card debt surpassing $1.13 trillion, setting historic records. Concurrently, average annual percentage rates on commercial bank credit cards rose to historic highs, exceeding 21.5%. This increase in carrying costs directly amplifies the financial strain on households. Rolling balances month over month, delinquency rates on credit cards and auto loans have escalated, with transitions into serious delinquency, defined as payments 90 days or more past due, reaching levels not observed since the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, particularly among younger demographics and lower income brackets. This expansion of high-interest debt occurs alongside the proliferation of alternative financing instruments. The rapid growth of buy now, pay later platforms has created a secondary, largely unrecorded tier of consumer liability. These short-term point-of-sale installment loans are frequently utilized for routine purchases, including groceries, apparel, and basic household goods. Because many installment lenders do not comprehensively report to major credit reporting agencies, traditional metrics measuring aggregate consumer debt undercount the true volume of active household liabilities. Simultaneously, commercial enterprises have adopted structural operational adjustments to manage rising labor, logistics, and insurance costs. Rather than implementing explicit price increases on shelf items, corporations have increasingly relied on subtle value reduction strategies. Shrinkflation, the practice of reducing product volume or package dimensions while maintaining price points, has affected categories ranging from packaged foods to paper goods. Independent consumer audits confirm that volume reductions between 8 and 15% have occurred across hundreds of standard consumer goods line items without corresponding price adjustments. A parallel operational trend, termed skimflation, involves the reduction of service quality, staffing levels, and operational hours to lower overhead. In retail and hospitality sectors, self-service checkout infrastructure has replaced labor-intensive customer service points, shifting operational tasks to the consumer while service fees remain flat or increase. Additionally, mandatory unbundled fees, including convenience surcharges, facility fees, and auto-renewing service tiers, have expanded across non-retail sectors such as healthcare, housing management, and public utilities. Corporate margin structures reveal that while input cost growth decelerated, gross profit margins in consolidated sectors such as food processing, multifamily housing management, and automotive insurance remained above historical averages. Economic analyses published by regional Federal Reserve banks indicate that corporate markup expansion accounted for a non-trivial portion of final consumer price increases, as market concentration allowed dominant firms to maintain elevated pricing power even as wholesale commodity prices moderated. The crisis is further exacerbated by acute regional cost pressures. Metro areas across the Sunbelt and Mountain West, which experienced significant population inflows during the remote work migration waves, now face severe municipal infrastructure bottlenecks. Local governments have adjusted property tax assessments upward to match inflated home valuations, while commercial and residential insurance premiums have surged nationwide. In states like Florida, Texas, and California, property insurance rates increased by double-digit percentages annually, driven by natural catastrophe risk modeling and rising reinsurance costs. For home-owning households, these secondary carrying costs, taxes and insurance, have frequently added hundreds of dollars to monthly housing expenditures, offsetting any stabilization in fixed mortgage principal and interest. In the labor sector, the nature of employment availability has shifted. While headline non-farm payroll figures show net positive job generation, detailed surveys from state labor agencies highlight a growing mismatch between job openings and wage viability. A significant share of job expansion has been concentrated in lower-margin service industries, healthcare assistance, and government positions, while higher-wage corporate, technology, and manufacturing sectors have engaged in strategic headcount freezes and targeted restructuring. Furthermore, average weekly hours worked by private sector employees have trended downward toward 34.2 hours per week. While seemingly minor, a fraction of an hour reduction across millions of hourly employees translates to an aggregate contraction in worker purchasing power without generating a corresponding increase in official unemployment statistics. Employers are systematically utilizing reduced shift allocations to manage labor budgets in lieu of executing formal worker terminations. This structural dead end leaves millions of households navigating a complex financial compromise. Aggregate national metrics, such as gross domestic product and gross consumer spending totals, continue to register expansion, largely because high-income households, benefiting from stock market performance and home equity gains, account for a disproportionate share of total domestic consumption. Meanwhile, the median consumer operates with diminished savings buffers, elevated high-interest debt balances, and structurally higher fixed operating expenses. The resulting landscape is not a traditional economic recession marked by sudden mass unemployment, but a prolonged, distributed erosion of real financial flexibility across the middle and lower tiers of the economy.